Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to take the discussion of adaptations, whether it be stuff being adapted from a book, a manga, anime, comic book, whatever the case may be. Should adaptations be 100% true to the original material is always the biggest question. And that to me is kind of a slippery slope. It's a complicated situation itself because, like, obviously I'm sure for some people it's like, I want everything literally from this book, this whatever, translated exactly to this other format, which is like, to me, I always have mixed feelings about that. I'm not saying everyone feels like that. I feel like a majority of people are like, keep certain elements the same. Sure, you can change it up a little bit, but don't change it up too much, because it's a situation of just kind of like, I feel like if it's an exact adaptation, it's like, well, what's the point? Like, because I think in my mind, it's kind of like, if you don't do your own thing with it, kind of twist it up a little bit, then it's like, you're just literally adapting the book. It's like, you might as well tell people just go watch the book, you know, but then the argument could be made like, oh, I mean, for someone like me who doesn't really read books, it's okay because it's like, oh, like, I'll watch the movie. The movie is obviously a much more condensed version. And that's the problem, because when it comes to a movie or a TV show, stuff gets cut out. It's like, you completely didn't include this, you didn't include that. I mean, that applies not just to books, but to everything that gets adapted. Because the thing is, like, you don't want to stray too far from the original material too, because it's like, if you do, people will also have a problem with that, because it's like, oh, you went off and took your liberties. You've already got so much established here. Just build upon that. You can do your own thing, but just don't completely, like, in some people's minds, shit on the original material. It's kind of the whole thing. Something I see very prevalent as someone who doesn't read books, but who picks up a little bit here and there about comic books, using Preacher for example. Like, it's only recently, like, as more and more of the shows come out, I've looked up more and more on, like, okay, so what's the difference between this season and the comic book? And obviously the TV show is very true to certain aspects, certain characters, introductions and stuff like that, but certain character stories play out completely different. Using an example would be Hoover and Featherstone. That situation works out completely differently in the comic books. Obviously I won't go into spoilers and stuff like that, but even Hoover's story plays out way differently to a certain extent. So it's kind of like, huh, that's an interesting thing. And that's always a thing too when it comes to adaptations. I'm kind of like, okay, at the very least you're keeping it different enough. I think for one, it's like, for the people who read the original material this way, you're not completely spoiled, that there will be surprises for you. But like I said, there's even limits to how much you could stray away from it without pissing people off. It's almost like you have to find this sweet spot of a balance between keeping the original material while also doing your own thing with it. In certain regards, like I said, at the end of the day, it comes down to the material itself, because it also comes down to whether it is based on or inspired by, because inspired by and based on or can be very, very loose in many occasions. A great example is iZombie. Not trying to take away from the show, because I love the show, but it is heavily loosely based on the comic book, which I didn't know that until time came around more and more, because obviously the TV show, if you're unfamiliar, iZombie is more focused on zombies and it's more of a science fictional show, whereas the comic book, while it focuses on its zombie main protagonist, I don't know if zombies are as big of a focus as they are in a TV show, because in a comic book goes a more supernatural route and includes, like, one of her friends is a were-terrier, another friend of hers is a ghost, so it's definitely on the more supernatural side of things. Another great example of that would be The Walking Dead. There are characters that are dead in a comic book that are still alive in a TV show currently, and then vice versa. There are people that are dead in a TV show that are super alive in a comic book. So it's kind of like, you know, in that sense, because it's like, it's always keeping you on your toes, because you think, you know, just because these characters are, there's no way you do, oh wait, this and that happens. So it's kind of like, okay. So there's an understanding to that aspect of, like, you have to do your own thing in some regards, because if you don't, then it's just gonna be like, you know, no surprises. No one will ever be caught off guard if you don't do your own thing. Like the big deaths at the beginning of season 7 in The Walking Dead, it kind of spoilers, but one of those deaths was the exact same way it happened in the comic books, but there was a surprise death beforehand. So it's like, oh, I guess they're not doing that. And then it's like, oh, bam, we are doing that too. So it's like kind of like a double bluff. The only thing I ever feel like that translates well when it gets adapted, at the very least in certain regards, is manga to anime. Because typically I feel like, where some people would want, you know, TV shows or movies to kind of be this, like, it's like panel for panel in some regards, which, you know, even The Walking Dead has gotten a lot of stuff where it's like, that's exactly, that shot is exactly out of the comic book. But I feel like typically anime, I mean, maybe this isn't 100% accurate. I've never done 100% side by side, but from some stuff I've seen here and there, it's like, man, this was exactly out of the manga in that same regard. And I feel like Anime tend to be a much truer adaptation to manga than I feel like anything else that gets adapted gets turned into. To be fair, that's an interesting situation in itself, because it actually plays into what I was talking about before, because if you get this adaptation that's very loosely based on something, it's okay because it's its own thing, and you can go off and read the original material to kind of get a different story in a sense, just like using iZombie, because it's like, oh, you get this awesome science fictional zombie show, but then you go read the comic book and you kind of get like a different tale following a different person, because it's like, they're two different continuities that can coexist at the same time without stepping on each other's toes. It gets, yeah, there's a whole using the same titling. I treat it kind of like the Being Humans TV shows. Like, I've treated like they can exist at the same time. I feel like if you look at the continuities, like they literally can exist at the same time in the same universe, because they're doing their own thing. They're not the same characters. They kind of have similar storylines, but obviously at times branch off and do their own thing. Getting back to what I was trying to say about anime and manga, you take like an anime typically doesn't like, animes typically don't cover the entire story of a manga, in the sense of like, typically an anime can cover anywhere between like maybe a fifth to maybe like 90%. Like you take something like Bleach, for example, like whether it be like because it ended, got canceled, whatever the case may be, Bleach, the anime ended before the, like one arc before the end of the series. Granted, it was later on because like the creator of Bleach was kind of rushed later on. I don't know if that was necessarily because of the final arc. I don't know if he was rushed to get to the final arc, but I know like definitely at the end of the final arc, he was kind of being rushed to finish things up. So I don't, you know, that's where I'm kind of like, I don't 100% know about that specific situation. But typically, anime don't always cover all of a manga. There are exceptions like Naruto. I'm sure One Piece is going to be like that. Detective Conan, they might be one of those series where it's kind of like, I mean, it depends on how things kind of play out, but I kind of get the feeling like they'll cover the entire manga. Because also there's that whole aspect of when something gets adapted, it's condensed. So it's like what normally would be like 2 or 3 chapters in the manga will be like one episode of an anime. But there's obviously the whole aspect of like, there are things that aren't always translated over. Like using an example is, well, manga / anime series called Dead Man's Wonderland. There are characters that only pop up in the manga that never pop up in the anime, and the anime covers like you know 2/5 to like 40% roughly. So, but there are characters that like if you were to pick up the manga, which is kind of a point I'm sorry I kind of lost myself. I was kind of saying like at the very least when it comes to anime and manga, you finish the anime and you can kind of pick the manga up roughly where the anime ended, because typically they kind of go hand in hand. Not always, like I said, using Dead Man Wonderland as an example. It's like if you didn't read the manga, you'd be like, who the hell are these characters? Who are these dead men I know nothing about? There's even like a character that he exists in both the anime and the manga. It's been such a long time, so I forgot his name. I want to say his name is Yu. There's a character that also exists in the comic book that exists alongside him, but in the anime, Yu, if that is his name, takes his storylines as well as his other character that exists in the manga and kind of plays out her storylines as well in the anime, which is kind of an interesting thing. So that's one way of kind of compensating. Like you can have multiple characters, 2 or more, kind of being warped into just one character to kind of fill all those roles, kind of condensing things down. Maybe there's certain things that you kind of feel like won't translate well into another adaptation, so you kind of skip over it. Maybe you think it's such a minor detail it's not worth going into, because when you're trying to do your own thing with an adaptation, you kind of feel like that is going to be kind of like a, it's not going to be 100% of what I want to do with it, so it's going to complicate things. Kind of going back to it again because I can't shut up about the show. iZombie. Maybe someone wanted to go more down a science fictional route and kind of adding in supernatural stuff like weird terriers and ghosts. It's like, that's going to complicate things, so we'll just keep it purely a zombie show. Maybe it'd be a lot easier to handle zombies, especially because zombies are kind of like a big popular thing. So adding in other supernatural stuff into something that's very science fictional based, especially that's how you're setting it up, would be hard to kind of like realistically, which is weird considering we're bringing in science fiction, but still it'd be hard to kind of realistically like easily weave that into the plot like that. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't blend supernatural and science fiction. You totally can, because you have like Legends of Tomorrow being a time travel show where magic and magical creatures are becoming a big thing this season. So obviously it can happen, but nevertheless. I didn't actually bring this up, but I actually do know another real good adaptation in many different regards. You take like Teen Wolf, for example. That TV show is way different from the movie because it kind of does its own thing. It's something I've even talked about recently, but it's just kind of like that TV show kind of takes things from a more horror point of view. It has a bit of a comedy element, but you look at like the movies are purely a comedy, but it's like, look at the TV show, things get bloody. There's a lot more of a teen drama aspect to it in certain regards, because obviously it's a TV show, so the narrative is allowed to kind of breathe, but they kind of do their own thing with this original material, that being the Teen Wolf movie. Another example would be Haven. Haven is very loosely based off of a book called The Colorado Kid by Stephen King. Now, when I saw based on, I was like, oh, it must be an exact thing. Hence where my knowledge of like, oh, based on does not mean 100% based on, is because I ended up looking into it much later on, but The Colorado Kid is almost nothing like the TV show Haven. The Colorado Kid, from what I've pieced together, because I don't read books, but from what I've seen online, it was kind of like the Colorado Kid is more of a murder mystery, where certain aspects of Haven kind of fall in that line, but Haven has this whole supernatural aspect with the troubles that does not exist. Certain characters crossed over into the TV show, but they aren't the same versions of themselves that they are in the book, so it's a completely different story in its sense. So like, once again, the whole aspect of based on or inspired by are very like loose terms that can be used, because even using like superhero stuff, for example, like a lot of stuff does their own things with their own continuities, kind of what I was bringing up before, kind of doing your own thing with certain things. Like, use all the superhero shows, like those aren't one-for-ones to their comic book counterparts. Using like Legends of Tomorrow, again, like Sarah Lance's whole story from going from Black Canary to White Canary, that does not exist in the comic books. I don't think Sarah's character doesn't actually even exist in the comic books, to my knowledge. So that whole story arc is only for her specifically in the TV show. So I don't know, it was just kind of like a fascinating discussion that I kind of had in the back of my head, because it's always something that kind of comes up when, you know, stuff gets adapted, because people are like, oh, I didn't like that adaptation, because that's always a comment of like, oh, the book is better than, you know, the TV show or the movie and this and that. So it's always kind of an interesting thing. Ultimately, my question is, how do you feel about adaptations? Do you prefer them to be a lot closer to the original material, or are you completely okay with them kind of doing their own thing? Because like I said, I'm sure it's not a black and white thing for a lot of people. I'm sure there's like shades of gray where it's like, I'm fine with you doing your own thing, but at least keep certain aspects, maybe the world, these characters, like these rich characters, this rich world, kind of keep it true, and then maybe you can kind of do your own thing within that world with these characters, as long as you don't, in some people's words, bastardize them, then we're good. You know, like I said, it also comes down to the material, it comes down to the fandom, like it comes down to who's actually doing the adaptation. So I'm sure that all plays a huge factor in it. So, I don't know, just let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'm very fascinated to kind of hear other people's opinions about this. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. Until the next one we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and good